Welcome to the Art of Arms podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of historical fencing. Today's guest is Christian Cameron.
Today's guest is Christian Cameron. For those of you who aren't familiar with Christian, he's probably, in my opinion, one of the greatest historical fiction authors at the time. I know that's a lot to say.
That's a little I was thinking you're underselling it, but go ahead.
I'm serious. I've been reading historical fiction my entire life, and his books have absolutely captured my interest in historical fiction in a way that I can't compare. And I've read all the greats. So, Christian, it's an honor to have you. Welcome to the Art of Arms podcast.
I don't know how to answer that now that wow. Have you read Dorothy Dunit? That's my instant answer. Whenever I hear somebody say you're really good at historical fiction, have you read Dorothy Dunit? She's my favorite.
Okay.
I have not. So now I have somebody else to read, which is great. I'm not going to complain.
No, and I love it when people give me book recommendations because frankly, I could read a book about every other day plus research material, and so I'm like an addict, always scrambling for my next. Like, please tell me an author with 35 books who I'll like.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for a lovely introduction.
You know who has 35
Yes.
books? Marino Sanudo.
Oh, yeah.
He's got plenty of reading material.
He does. That's jumping into Venice there, Stephen.
Sorry, my bad.
So, Christian, why don't you tell us a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in Western martial arts?
Sure. Wow. I guess I'll just retell this story. When I was 17 and 18 years old, my best friend and I would literally get up at 5:30 in the morning so that we could meet in parks in Rochester, New York, dressed in 17th century clothes with rapiers, and we'd fence one-touch duels. Now, both of us were épée fencers, and we'd never seen any of the treaties that we now, sort of devour. So we were just basically fencing épée with slightly heavier weapons because he'd picked up two really quite good, I still have one of them, rapier blades in Spain, and we'd made hilts for them ourselves. Anyway, that's so back in the day. I think we're in 1978 now in parks in Rochester, New York. And the first manual I ever saw was Angelo's small sword manual. I was very interested in the American Revolution at the time. I reenacted the American Revolution for 35 years, and I saw the small sword manual, and then I think I saw Sir John Hope in an English edition, and all of this would be like the late 80s. And then while I was in the Navy, I only really did mainstream sort of classical fencing because I was in the same building for a while as the Navy fencing team, so it was very convenient to sort of go downstairs and find really good fencers. And then in the late 90s, through another friend, it's funny because I'd virtually stopped fencing. Another friend of mine introduced me to Fiore. In fact, we had a big argument in which I basically said if there was an illustrated manual from the late 14th century, the subject on which I got my degree in university, I'd know about it, which is one of those things where you sometimes come across as a complete idiot. But after it had been demonstrated to me that I was a complete idiot, I was almost instantly a fan. And finally, and I think you know this part of the thing, I decided sort of about the same time that I was going to single-handedly recreate all of ancient Greek hand-to-hand combat. And I was interested in Pancratian, and I was sort of interested in the whole smorgasbord of Greek combat. And because I just discovered Fiore, and because at some remove, I'd met Greg Melee and Guy Windsor. It was suggested to me that I get involved, that I learn Fiore so that I would like acquire the tools to better examine ancient Greek vase art. And somewhere along in there, it's not that I lost interest in Hoplomachia. I just really gained interest in Fiore. And I'm because you have a martial arts based podcast, I'm going to feel that I can advertise this. Fighting in 14th century armor under the IAS rules with steel weapons is the closest thing I've ever encountered to combining my love of authentic reenacting with a combat art. Because in full armor with proper mail and all the fixings doing the art, you can do almost anything without hurting your friend. And you don't have to wear extra protective gear because you're in armor. And almost everything in Fiore and most of the other contemporary manuals really works. Some cases better in armor. I could do a whole thing on this that sometimes I think the earlier maestros are really talking to an armored audience, but I really liked that. And so I kind of lost my way with my original intention to go to Hoplomachia because I'd fallen in love with armored combat. And only now, as I was just saying to Josh, I'm sort of working my way slowly back through side sword to rapier, where I started after putting in 20 years in armored combat.
Awesome.
And I've left some stuff out in that long discussion, like I did armored fighting in the SCA and I did rapier fighting in the SCA. That was all in the 80s. I've sort of bopped in and out of this.
I mean, yeah, you've been around it for a very long time, which is fascinating. I mean, you've got tremendous insight. So how did you get into the historical fiction and writing? Was it just a wanting to sort of live out the characters and sort of explore some of the personalities that you were learning about? Was it just that combination of history and creativity that just kind of drove you towards it?
So first of all, I've got to say that my dad was a writer and a damn good writer. And he wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote a lot of books. He was a serious academic writer, but he also wrote some mystery fiction, and he wrote a couple of historical novels. And he really got me started on historical novels. And I have always thought that a good historical novel is a painless but accurate introduction to a time period. Like, you won't learn everything, but you should learn some stuff.
Yeah.
And so fast forward to when I got out of the Navy, I'd already started writing spy novels. I wrote a few with my dad because I knew a little about spying because I was a clandestine intelligence officer for a while. And then
clandestine.
Well, yeah, you can mock it, but clandestine means like undercover, and that's
yeah.
It's a whole world.
Yeah,
it's just it's such a great word. I wasn't trying to mock it. I just thought that's a
anyway.
Yeah, I was enjoying the.
I wrote some spy novels, and they did okay. And then at some point, I wrote them with my dad. I wrote 8 spy novels. We wrote them together, and my dad had also been an intelligence officer. And to be honest, we actually sort of wrote 8 novels vaguely mocking the spy world. So it's completely okay if you mock away. I've always wanted to write a novel called Zero Sum Game, in which almost nothing happens, but an enormous amount of government money is spent, because that is to some extent the view I have coming away from it.
So you were on the John le Carré side than the Ian Fleming side.
A lot more John le Carré and a little bit of Graham Greene.
Okay, yeah, and it's all basically a giant farce.
Well, it's not like once or twice, if I were allowed to, but I won't, I could tell a story of something that worked and had a real positive effect. And I did some absolutely, I'm still proud of it, stuff that was mostly rescuing NGOs.
Oh, great.
Like no
awesome.
skullduggery, no shooting. know nothing, just like walking a long distance and saying, come with me, we're going to walk out and get in a helicopter and you're not going to be in the way of this war anymore. I think that's all fine. And I think that nation states need people to do that sort of thing. However, the James Bond part, just don't get me started. That's another podcast.
There goes our suggestion, Stephen. He's already shot it down.
Anyway, when I came out of that, I was writing. I'd already written a couple of spy novels with my dad, and I wanted to write a historical novel because that's my fantasy and historical are the two things I love to read. So I wanted to write them. And so I wrote a novel called Washington and Caesar, which you may never have seen, about George Washington's slaves running away to join the British Army and fight for freedom. It really happened. That is what really happened, and it was incredibly unpopular. I wonder why. Like,
so what wasn't unpopular though was the stories of William Gold. You want to tell us a little bit about where that came from, and then like how your HEMA experience connected with that?
Sure. So I did 14th century England and really Italy as the major subject of my honors thesis in university. I've never not been interested. So even when I was in the Navy or whatever, I would read whatever scholarship came out. And when I say scholarship, I don't just mean like the military aspects or the martial aspects. I mean, my mentor, Richard Kuiper, his area was banking. And if you've read the William Gold books, there's a lot of banking floating around in the background. Cool. And how medieval economics actually worked and the economics of war. Like most historical writers who write military epics don't want to tell you how many mules it takes to move the grain to feed the army so that the archers aren't hungry on Saturday morning when they fight the French. But quite frankly, that's the part that mostly interests me. I'm interested in the martial aspects too, but I'm very interested in how it all happens and how it comes together. Why is there a battle? A question that I feel that more historical and fantasy writers don't tell me about the battle. Tell me why there's a battle. And and so William Gold kind of came out of a whole bunch of things, but first and foremost, I'll blame William Cafaro. So William Cafaro is a modern American academic. He wrote a book on John Hawkwood that when I read it, how can I put this? I knew 85% of the things in that book before I read the book, but the way he assembled the information and the new political information that he provided blew me away. It was just so, and I don't usually get blown away by secondary sources. I'm the sort of arrogant person who says, I read primary sources. But Cafaro's book was
Is that arrogant? That's not really arrogant. That's like you don't want secondhand, stories. You want the real McCoy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I got to Cafaro and I was blown away. And Cafaro talked about this lieutenant of Hawkwood's named William Gold, who
perfect.
I hadn't tripped over. And I got to tell you, in case you don't already know this, my William Gold is a hell of a lot better human being than the original William Gold.
He is, yeah.
But at the same time, one of the things I love about writing historical fiction, it's like, anyway, I love doing research, so I love that about it. But I also love getting what I call the ladder built for me. You could call it a timeline. I call it a ladder because I see it as more of a three-dimensional thing. But having the action all plotted against the background of things that actually happened is fun. I don't know. It's like a game trying to plug the characters in and out. And my first historical novel had George Washington as a major character. I like writing people who really lived. And I like burrowing down, reading everything about them, reading anything they wrote. I read all of George Washington's letters before I wrote one line out of his mouth because I wanted my George Washington to sound something like George Washington. And that's how I feel about John Hawkwood. And I think my John Hawkwood is much more like a character from The Sopranos than he ought to be. But but that's how I see John Hawkwood too, is as a sort of very cunning enforcer for the mob.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say it's environmental in that case, right? Because Italy hasn't changed. I mean, like, I feel like the mafia coming into the United States and kind of establishing their familial dynasties was just an extension of Italian politics and the way that Italians have kind of done things for a long time.
It does kind of all their history, at least the Renaissance stuff that we've been working with, all sort of reads like a giant mafia story.
Yeah.
Hey, my favorite scene of my own in all the William Gold books is when John Hawkwood confronts Robert of Geneva in a chapel in Milan. I don't know if it ever happened, but Robert of Geneva went on to be the butcher of Cesena and the anti-pope. And John Hawkwood probably killed more people than the plague. And I needed to have these two basically mob leaders confront each other in a situation where someone had to back down. Anyway, I wrote William Gold because the moment I read Cafero's John Hawkwood, I'm like, wow, this is... I am friends with enough other historical fiction writers like Ben Kane, who I think is a really good writer in the UK, and Simon Turney, who isn't big in the States but writes like Ottoman and stuff. And we talk about this very moment when you go, wow, it's all done for me. There is a guy who is Hawkwood's lieutenant and also may have been at the Siege of Alexandria. What more do I need? It's like
done deal.
At the time, I was just really getting into Fiore. I had dabbled in Fiore, but and I think I was sitting with the guy who got me into Fiore in the first place, a friend of mine named Cole Siren, who was teaching Fiore's wrestling system at the time, and he and I think we're just drinking wine, and it literally hit me. I can have Fiore as a character. All I need to do is because we know nothing about Fiore before he worked for Mantua and Gonzaga. I'm like, wait, right. He could do anything in the late 14th century. I can make him anyone I want. And that, for a lot of people, that made the series. People write to me all the time and are like, you have Fiore as a character.
Yeah, no, and Fiore is a great character in the book. I love him. We've kind of touched a lot on our research recently on the latter years of Fiore's life. Right now, I'm working on something that almost has turned into a book on Baldassare Cosa, and when we had a conversation not too long ago with a gentleman from Finland named Joeli Takala, and he told us about there was a connection where his prospective historical figure that might be Jonas Lichtenauer was banking with a Bolognese nobleman named Nane Gazzarini. And we were, at the time I was writing this article about Lanceolato Beccaria, who was one of Fiore's students, and he was in Bologna, and so I was kind of focused on the story of Giovanni Bentivoglio and Nane Gazzarini and sort of the rivalry that they had, and then of course Milan comes down and wipes out the early instances of the Bentivoglio in power. But in the wake of that, Nane Gazzarini, it's actually a pretty compelling story. If you ever want another like really awesome story with some interesting twists and turns and some heartbreak, Nane Gazzarini, like, he realizes that Giovanni Bentivoglio was right all along and that they couldn't trust the Visconti, and so he ends up doing everything that he possibly can to oust the Visconti. So he ends up going to Ferrara with Niccolo III d'Este, and he's a banker, and he's also very close friends with Niccolo III d'Este. And so Joeli told us that Nane Gazzarini was the banker for Hans Rommel, who was his prospective Jonas Lichtenauer. And I was researching this Baldassare Cosa thing, and I was like, holy shit. after 1403, Nani Gazzarini was running all of his banking operations out of Ferrara because he had been exiled by Baldassare Cosa. And there's a legitimate chance, if Fiore was actually in Ferrara in the latter portions of like in like around 1408, 1409, that those two could have had an interaction or could have met, which is unbelievable.
The same research also showed that the prospective Lichtenauer also took a trip through northern Italy at the time when it was either Beccaria or it was Gonzaga had his famous duel in Padua.
Yeah, Galeazzo di Mantua.
So it's quite possible that Lichtenauer watched the duel that Fiore was coaching one of the participants for, which was kind of a fun notion.
See, I've kind of always imagined this anyway. I'm not a Lichtenauer guy. In fact, I'll say, and I mean no offense to anyone, I've deliberately walled myself off from the whole world of German longsword because I'm a history nerd and I want to do Fiore the way, at least unpolluted by like early HEMA, and I mean 90s and early 21st century HEMA was very German oriented, and that painted a lot of practitioners. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying I'm a colossal history nerd, so I've tried to keep myself very Italian. But having said all that, right now I'm reading a pile of glosses on Lichtenauer, and I've got to say that it really does sound like Lichtenauer and Fiore are very much in the same art. I mean, that's a translation. But I'm going to now see Lichtenauer through Fiore eyes, which is like the opposite of the way most people came to Fiore in the 90s, right?
But it might actually be the correct way, right? We might actually have this historical lineage that proves that Fiore would have been that senior master who a young Jonas Lichtenauer would have had some sort of training or experience from.
Well, you're going to make Greg Melee really, really happy. Oh, that's all I can say.
Yeah, I've told him this, and he loves it. Yeah, he's on board for sure. But I mean, you can't really do Marozzo without, or at least Marozzo two-handed sword stuff, without some German influence. The German school.
Roberto Gotti would be in complete denial there. Anyway, I understand.
I'm speaking strictly from a historical perspective, not from an actual like textual like looking at Marozzo and forcing KDF into it, but from a historical perspective, the influence of German speaking people, and people coming from Germany. I mean, one of his famous students was Giacomo Crafter, who was a German merchant. And we have a lot of biographical details that we found about him and his family. So he's actually Scottish, which is interesting.
I would. Sorry, Stephen.
Oh, I was going to say another point for interpretation too is that it's worth knowing all of the possible things that can be done with a sword before you actually decide upon what an interpretation is saying. So it's great to expand all the varieties and then look at it from the perspective of our authors are trying to describe essentially a thing of unlimited possibilities with limited technical vocabulary. That's all I was going to say.
What I was going to say is that I think that the term German is an interesting term because in 14th century Italy and 15th century Italy, there were a lot of families that thought of themselves as German that had come in the 12th and 13th century as military families to northern Italy. Mm-hmm. And curiously, if you go to my favorite place in the world to fight in armor is in Verona because they have a really good tournament there. And when you go there, you discover that there's families that still think of themselves as German or leap to tell you of their noble German origins. And that, and then I'm way off topic, but my sister-in-law is from Friuli, and she sort of rolls her eyes and says, Bavarian Italian, what generation? Because and I think that when you get up to Udine, you're teetering on the edge of German.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in Bologna in particular, so the whole area of Bologna and most of the Romagna, and this is probably why they were always at war with one another, or at least like in perpetual war, not with one another, but just in perpetual war, was settled by most of Charlemagne's generals. So there were a lot of land grants in that northern Italian sphere that were, French, German. I mean, two of the biggest families that we typically follow through like 14th and 15th century into 16th century Italian, like Bolognese history, are all like the Malvezzi family are German. The Mariscotti family are Scottish. They were a part of the Douglas clan and came down with Charlemagne. So we've like, there's a lot that we see like that.
Even the Lombards came from Bavaria into northern Italy. Anyway, here we are.
Here we are. Yeah. Okay. Getting far afield now.
Well, I mean, the complexity of history, right? It's beautiful. It's a wonderful
it is
thing.
beautiful. And I'll just toss in as like my last shot on William Gold. I wanted to write a medieval series that, first of all, was not set in England. Sorry, but there's just a ton of historical.
A ton.
What stuck with me was that my medieval mentor in university said, when Venice fought Genoa in the War of Chioggia, those two cities had larger GNPs than England and France, and that the War of Chioggia had a more abiding, immediate effect than the 100 Years' War, and that that basically any two Italian states were as important as England and France, and that we only cared about the 100 Years' War because we were English-speaking Americans, and otherwise,
100%.
If England hadn't gone on to have a giant empire, no one would remember. The 100 Years' War would be yet another squabble between barbarians. I think that's how Dick Kuiper actually.
That's exactly what it would be.
And so I really wanted to talk about Italy, and that meant actually talking about Italian politics, and not just having a heroic John Hawkwood marching around, and winning another victory or losing, which he did a fair number of times, but to try to get into the knickers of like who's fighting whom and why, and why should we care? The money, it's all in Italy, and that meant that it was going to have a component about banking, and so. That's why at the same time that I decided to have Fiore, I decided to have his other best friend, Nerio Acquoli, the natural son of the rich, of the Bill Gates of the, the early Italian Renaissance, the guy who worked his way up from the mailroom to being not just one of the greatest knights in Europe, but the richest banker. To me, another great story. What, you mean you didn't even start out as a noble? You're some guy in the mailroom of a Florentine bank. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. So I was wondering, could we segue over to Greece for a little bit? Because you also have a series that was set
only
in
if
Greece.
You let me say one more thing, which is my harness is Niccolò Aicuolo's harness. So,
dope. Well, that's great.
Before he died, he looked at the funerary statue, and it says in his own words, "This is the harness I wore to fight in Greece." And so, to the best of our ability, Juri Klipach and Prague and I have recreated that harness. Anyway, on to Greece. Sure, we can do Greece.
So, I was wondering. I want to contrast Athens and Sparta a little bit, because everybody's like. I mean, my kids and everybody's like, ooh, Sparta, they're so great, blah, blah, blah. But, they may have even won the Peloponnesian War, but they're just a giant chunk of rocks now, and Athens is this big city. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the contrast between Athens and Sparta.
So, Steve, I don't think it'll be a secret from you that I'm not a big fan of Sparta.
Okay.
So, on the one hand, I can synopsize my answer by saying, read Mike Cole's The Bronze Lie. It's a really, really good book, and it tells the hard truth about what basically various forms of fascism have done with Sparta that isn't really fair to Sparta, but it has really changed how we look at Sparta today. Because it's worth saying that respectable ancient Greeks thought that Sparta was to their world what, let's say, France was to the later Middle Ages, which is to say the font of chivalry, the home of martial valor. Like, I think it's fair that even Athenian gentlemen, and when I say gentlemen, it's my view that I have recently heard might be more academically defensible than I used to think, but that I have a very medieval view of ancient Greece. And so I see the front rank fighters in the phalanx almost as knights. And sure. I think I could back that with some fact, but just roll with me here for a moment. So when you're an Athenian guy of the sort of upper middle class, and you know you're going to fight in the phalanx, you're going to probably dye your chiton red and ape Spartan manners and maybe even wear your hair like a Spartan for the same exact reason that the best English knights and the best Italian knights tried to look like French knights. Like, it's not that you're admiring their whole political system or anything. You're just like, those are the kings of chivalry, and it's much the same thing.
Got it.
I think for the Spartan ethos. And from a darker perspective, I don't think we can hide that alongside Athenian democracy, and I think this is directly applicable to the world we're all living in right now, there was always a bunch of Athenians who really wanted to be oligarchs and serious aristocrats, the way the Spartans were. And they didn't really...
Can't get away from that, can you?
No.
You know, well, a friend of mine...
Aristotle says as much, right?
Yeah. A friend of mine says the fascists are always with us. And but I think that there were Athenians who might have been fighting the Spartans in the front rank, or who nonetheless in many ways thought, yeah, I wish we were them. I wish we had helots. I wish we were genuine aristocrats. I wish we didn't have to listen to the frickin' oarsmen vote in the assembly. And I wish we didn't have to treat our lower classes like people. I'm afraid I think that was always there in Athens. And okay. you can from time to time hear it. But the reasons I think of Athens as the better culture, I can synopsize in 2 or 3 very short stories. One is, if you stood up to lead the vote for war, odds were really good you'd get to be the polemarchos, and so you could stand in the right front of the phalanx, the right end of the front rank. I no longer have this factoid memorized, but I'm pretty sure it's something like 92 of 132 polemarchs died in battle. So if you stand up to move the assembly for war, you're saying, I am so angry at X that I am willing to die on this.
How do we make that happen in our country? That sounds like a great rule.
And my other factoid, my other 2 factoids. So one is, there's a lot to ancient Greek culture that's very homoerotic. And I don't deny that at all, and I would recommend that everyone who's interested in that read Greeks and Greek Love by James Davidson, because he makes really good points in every direction. You know, like the term gay doesn't apply because gay is a modern issue, and that homosexuality is sometimes just homoeroticism without any sexuality. It's just like, wow, men are really attractive. But another point he makes that I think is a great point is that when you look at another guy and he's got an 8-pack, what he's saying to you is, I'm ready to do my citizen service in the phalanx. I'm ready. Are you ready? Are you fit? Because that's life in a city state. Like, they were not peace states. They were war states, and right. They fought all the time. But it is an interesting, I'd never thought of it before I read James Davidson. It's like, oh yeah, if you're you're just showing off that you're ready to go. Like, when we have to march off, when my little gray clay ball falls out of the machine and I'm like going off to Amphipoli, I'm ready to go. And I think that that's a very interesting way to view citizenship. And then my last Athenian factoid is that the very rich had the choice each year of sponsoring a warship or sponsoring a major theater event. And
that sounds great.
I kind of love that all by itself, but also anyone from any rank of life could challenge a rich person who declined to fund a warship or a theater event. So let's say Bob says, well, I'm rich, but not really rich enough to pay for a warship. Then Dave, the oarsman, could say, yes, you are. And here's the deal. And the courts would adjudicate this. Dave gets all of Bob's worldly goods, all of them. Bob gets all of Dave's worldly goods, almost none of them. And then Dave builds the warship, and whatever's left over, he can keep.
Oh, God, man, they had it figured out. That is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant.
I can't think of a modern equivalent because, of course, one of the major differences between their society and ours that I noticed that people like Republican apologists like Victor David Hanson never want to talk about is that the difference between the richest human being in ancient Greece and the poorest was like, I don't know, a factor of 16 or something like.
Right.
It was we're not in that ballpark. There was no Bill Gates. There's no one guy who can like buy the whole Navy and also maybe an Air Force too. So that's really different. But amongst citizens, yeah, you could just challenge and go like, he won't put on a play. I'll put on a play.
Nice. With all his property?
Yeah, I'll take a. Yeah.
Can we talk?
That's Athens.
I remember you had a surprising anecdote for me about Socrates, who we have as this like famous philosopher, and people kind of think he's probably sort of a pansy, but he was actually a war hero, wasn't he?
Absolutely, yes. I don't know. I think I only discovered this like 15 years ago, and I keep proposing to my publishers as I get more, I don't know, famous or whatever I get, that somebody like me should write a historical novel about Socrates called something like Socrates War Hero. The reason that Athenians would put up with this shit, and I can't think of a better way to put it, because just imagine a guy who walks around, he's poor, he's always a little dirty, he's not pretty, and he just walks around saying like, so why do you think that?
Yeah.
But the reason they can't get rid of him is that he was at the time one of Athens' great war heroes. He alone in the rout stood his ground, and he stood his ground so long that people rallied around him. And then basically the sort of good boy of ancient Athens, Alcibiades, rode in with the cavalry and rescued him because he'd actually stopped the rout in one of the great Athenian defeats of all time, and no one ever forgot that. Probably because he saved, like when he's being a dick in the assembly, there's 100 guys literally going, "Well, I'm alive because of dickhead."
Yeah. Have you ever read Stephen Pressfield's Tides of History?
I think I've read every Stephen Pressfield. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Even though he's a lot more pro-Spartan than me, but yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm also a fairly not pro-Spartan, but that's also because my deep dives in history have given me a bent towards Thebes and towards the Boeotian hegemony, which Epaminandis, I think, is probably the greatest Grecian character that you can possibly imagine. He used to be like, there's a garden of like great historical pillars in England, right? And they have a statue of Epaminondas. And I don't know what happened in the 19th century that people forgot who Epaminondas was. But from most historical sources that I've come across, most people perceive Epaminondas as being one of the greatest like Greek generals ever.
No question, but I think I can tell you what happened from a historiographical point of view. Xenophon refuses to name him because he hated him so much.
Right, because he thought he was a pedophile. Yeah.
Well, okay, could I also say, and again, Greeks and Greek Love, really, really good book, full of facts I had not known. So every Greek city-state apparently went, those guys over there, they're gay. Like,
yeah. Well, so this is something. No, you actually bring up a really good point, because I hate Xenophon. I despise him. I think he's a traitor, first of all. But I also like, because and this is just me accepting the fact that I'm just going to take this Boeotian bias. Is Xenophon is always, because he's best friends with Lysander, and so he's down there with Cleombrotus and Lysander, and he's yucking it up, and so Epaminondas is over here, absolutely just taking him to town at Leuctra, and you know, they're upset, and so you know, Xenophon just basically goes on a campaign to try to write as much propaganda as he possibly can to the Athenians, to try to sway them away from supporting Thebes, which, you know, eventually they decided that they were going to do.
Josh, I agree with every word you just said. I just don't hate Xenophon. I think Xenophon's cavalry commander is one of the best military. It is a largely forgotten classic of basically being good at your job. And medieval Europeans would have benefited enormously from reading it, since they spent 400 years forgetting how scouting works. Anyway, I would, and I always see Xenophon, like some old friends of mine, as a very conservative guy who was good at his job and maybe shouldn't have been thought of as a philosopher. But at the same time, one of my favorite games to play when I was learning classical Greek was getting my Greek professors to read Xenophon's Apologia of Socrates, because many of them hadn't. And, you know, I did not know this until fairly recently, but Socrates was a bit of a stock character in the ancient world. And what I mean by that was he was so famous that we think of Plato's Socrates, right? Plato used Socrates as a sort of enunciator of his views. Yeah. Well, Xenophon did the same, but apparently there were 7 other authors in period, including one guy who wrote a pornographic Socrates.
Oh boy, that would be a fun read.
Which is unfortunately lost to us.
No, damn history.
But no, I'm just saying, like, which means that we can't believe a word that either Xenophon or Plato says, because it's like, I can't think of a modern character, but it's like, he was huge. Let's leave it there and not talk about the pornography.
So I think I want to say this about Epaminondas, because I want people to appreciate Epaminondas, and I think you're the right. I think you're the right person to do this with, right? When I think strategy, you know. And this is where, like, most of modern strategy is everybody reads Clashfits, and like Clashfits is the Bible, right?
I wish Pete Hegseth would read Clashfits.
But even using Clashfits' principles, what Epaminondas did to destroy the Spartan hegemony was absolutely brilliant. Rather than trying to, after he had already beat them at the Battle of Leuctra, rather than trying to conduct a campaign and maybe even fight a defensive campaign in Boeotia, he decided to march down into the south and free the Helots, and then create the city of Megalopolis, where he put all of the freed slaves, so that way if Sparta ever decided to march north, they would have to march past a city of ex-slaves that absolutely, generationally hated their guts. That is the most brilliant strategic play I've ever seen, and it's amazing, and nobody gives them enough credit for it. Everybody talks about the tactics at the Battle of Leuctra, and I'm looking at that and I'm like, that that is like gold.
Yeah, because that's long term.
I completely agree. Hey, you've left me with very little to say except that I love Megalopolis. I hope you get to go if you haven't been.
I mean, I have not been to Europe. I don't know why, and it breaks my heart. But when I do finally go, it's going to be. I have a lot of places I need to go.
On the back cover of one of my Greek books, I think it's New Achilles about Philopoemen. I'm sitting in Philopoemen's seat in the great theater of Megalopolis.
Oh.
And not that I fancy myself Philopoemen, but see, he's my unsung hero. I totally see what you love about Boeotia, as Americans say, Boeotia, but I love Philopoemen, trying to keep it real in Greece while the Romans are taking over the world.
Yeah.
Not trying to conquer anyone, just, Philopoemen was beloved by George Washington and like that whole founding fathers generation because he was viewed as having created a federal government over federal Achaea without interfering with the rights of individual states, so that he was. I think it was Washington who saw him literally as like, this is our pattern, this is our guy, and I'd never heard of him until when I was reading some of George Washington. I'm like, Philopoemen? Who's what? There's Greek generals I haven't heard of? Anyway, ask me another question, or ask Josh another question, or ask Steve another question. This is good. I like this.
So we should
actually,
probably... Oh,
that transitions really nicely, right?
I think we're heading to the lagoon, weren't we?
Yeah, we are, because you mentioned George Washington's exemplar, right? But now we could talk about John Adams' exemplars, which were the republics of Italy, right? And that would be the Venetian Republic, and of course the Bolognese Republic, and then the Florentine Republic. So I think
before we go, get to that, okay. I think we need to just take a moment to observe how completely awesome Venice is. It is, so far as I know, the only city in the world where some dude said, hey, to keep barbarians from killing us, we're going to build a city on the water. On the water. Like, who does that?
As a person who both loves camping and hates mosquitoes, I just like to know what the first 4 summers were like.
I'm sure it was like, Daddy, I'm tired of getting bit by mosquitoes. Yeah, you'd hate the Huns a lot more, so shut up and keep driving that pile.
Exactly. Daddy, can we go home to Aquila now? No, honey, Aquila's not there anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
This mud flat is where we live now.
But I mean, so most of what I know about the early history of Venice, everything comes from that Norwich book, The History of Venice, which I'm sure you've probably read it. Anyway, just a fabulous story about dudes coming from Aquileia and Padua and all sorts of places trying to avoid the Huns, living in these marshes, and then just building like stilts. And then almost like ants over generations, they build this enormous city just sitting on the water. I think it's just fascinating. And I just wanted to throw that in there because before we get into like modern Venice, it just like think about how amazing it is. All these people dragging their families out to the lagoon and then like building their city by driving piles through the mud and through the water into the ground. I think that's just, I don't know of any other places like that.
Steve, it's always a toss up to me, Venice or Greece. Venice or Greece. Yeah. My love for both of them is so enormous that I like, and it comes even down to like when Sarah and I are going on vacation and we'll go Venice or Greece. Anyway, and I'm never tired of Venice, and every time I see it on the horizon coming from the airport out onto the water or coming up the Lido or whatever, I'm like, pretty much what you just said. Wow, they built this on mud flats. Yeah. They were desperate. This city is an homage to human desperation.
Desperation, perseverance, basically two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the struggle of Venice perpetually, right?
And then they built this amazing government that, like, unlike everywhere else in Italy, never really had. I think they had, in the course of 1,500 years, had one violent revolt, and it was by Italian standards like a dust up.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And they managed to, like, do all this stuff without violence amongst each other. You know, it's like everybody outside the lagoon was their enemies, but inside they were like a team. And I just think that in studying history and seeing what douchebags human beings are, the fact that they were able to completely put all that aside and create this city that lasted for so long is just, it's a truly amazing human achievement.
You know, do you guys know that I've written a modestly successful science fiction novel called Artifact Space? Oh, you don't. Okay, so it's Venice in space, and it's
great.
800 years in the future. The United States is a dust bowl. North America is like barely habitable, and Italians and Africans have moved into space. They were the end spacefaring organizations that like made it, and it's a giant trade empire that is trying not to go to war with anyone. And it's Venice in space.
Sounds brilliant.
And I had a ball writing it, but I actually think, like John Adams, who didn't just love all the republics, he loved specific things about the checks and balances in the Venetian system. And so do I. And I mean, I think we're all getting a lesson on checks and balances now. When I took civics,
just a little bit.
My civics teacher was sure that we were completely set, that we had great checks and balances. Whereas when I was in Greece a month ago, my Greek Marxist friends and a table full of Italians and a table full of Turks on 3 separate evenings talking about American politics all smiled and basically said, virgins. Like, you just
Yeah, you're not so special anymore, are you, mother?
you haven't experienced tyranny as many times as we have, so that you can smell it coming. Was basically what they all said. Like, and they're like, yes, it's terrible. You'll get over it. You know, we trust Americans. Americans are smart people. And I'll be political for a moment and remind you that supposedly Winston Churchill said Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Anyway, but Venice, I'm not disagreeing, Steve, but Venice had a 150-year period where various families tried desperately to be the tyrant of Venice in the 8th and 9th century.
Okay.
And it sort of taught them the valuable lesson, like, never trust the guy in charge. And if you look at the history of Venice, I mean, and I'm sure somebody will now tell me that I'm all wrong, but I feel you can look at the history of Venice from the 10th century to the 15th century, and they just keep going like, all right, put another layer on the election. Like, make the election even more opaque. Nope, not opaque enough. Yeah. Right? Because by the time they're done, and I'm mostly kidding, but it's like, find 10 mice, kill 9 of them, open the innards of throw one in the water. If a shark eats it, go to the Contarini Palace and find 5 servants. Take those 5 servants downtown and ask them which color they prefer. The one who says red now gets to choose 10 people in the parliament. Like, it's like that. It's just so Byzantine, but it's all really, checks and balances.
It's all to make sure they don't end up with a dictator that tries to take over everything.
Yeah, right. And it's also impossible to form a faction to get voted in. It's literally impossible.
Right, because you're choosing somebody who chooses somebody who chooses somebody who then chooses somebody who chooses somebody who chooses somebody that goes on the election slate.
That's right. Yep. And you probably know this because you guys seem to know everything about Venice, but political parties were illegal. You couldn't form a party, and you couldn't have a meeting of more than 30 patricians at the same time. And that was incredibly effective, especially in the 16th century, when the sort of the rubber hit the road in the 16th century.
Yeah, their
and
back was really up against the wall. Yeah.
And the inability to have a functioning faction. Instead of using modern America, I'll use 18th century England. So at the time of Marlborough, while the British Crown and most people in England are committed to this basically world war with France, there's a faction, a political party in England that's like, or we could get the French to back a Catholic king and we could just betray everybody and start a new government.
Right.
And they get to sit in Parliament and vote on stuff, even though they are, in effect, voting for Louis XIV to win the War of the Spanish Succession. And that is exactly what Venice avoided, was ever having that be able to happen.
Yeah, kind of keeping the extremists out.
And you can make that sound really jingoistic. I think there's room there for that to be, like, not very nice. But because they're also a nation of merchants who travel all over the place and talk to everyone and really need to be kind of colorblind and kind of even religion blind, I think they managed to keep it together pretty well. Anyway, I'm a big fan. I feel like there's something about I'm in the 17th century here, but the Doge is like, well, we're going to have to fight Turkey, and the Arsenali down tools and go like, nope, we're not fighting Turkey. You did that 2 years ago. A lot of us died. You can pound sand.
Doesn't go well.
And that's it. And the Grand Council meets and goes like, and no, we're not going to war with Turkey. See, that was easy. And that is in some ways more democracy than we always have in the United States. Like, imagine if we all just down tools and if that was part of government, where you just go like, nope, don't want that.
Nope,
bad
not
idea.
happening. Sure, as long as the Doge goes on the first boat at the very front.
Well, I mean, if it's Andre Gritty, he is actually going to be there.
Oh, yeah, Andre Gritty is down.
He is the greatest badass, the best Doge, hands down.
Franchesco Morsini is the best Doge.
Which one's Morosini?
Gritty's story is so wild, though. Because he spends time, he's a diplomat in Turkey, and because he's down on his luck. I think he ran out of money, right, Stephen?
So he was a merchant. He was a merchant, and he was bros with the Sultan, actually. But at some point, the previous spy in Constantinople got busted, so he volunteered to become the new spy for Venice. But Turkey found out about it because he was sending in carpets, I think, a message about the size of the Turkish fleet that was gathering in the Golden Horn, I think it's called. And anyway, so the Turks intercepted the carpet, and so he's thrown into the clink, and they're going to go off with his head, but he's bros with the Sultan, and the Sultan lets him live. But he loses all his money, and then he's back in Venice, where you're talking about now. And of course, like anybody who's basically failed in business, he goes into politics.
Right, as you do. Yep.
Yeah.
As you do.
But the way that he took back Padua, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
With the carts under the gates and everything like that. And then leading the Venetian army during the siege of Padua was just a seminal moment in their history.
So which one is Morosini? Francesco Morsini, that's what you said?
So Francesco Morsini, you probably know him as the guy who blew up the Parthenon. He's the guy who blew up the Parthenon. So amongst other things, he was a very good Doge, probably gay, not guaranteed, but I'd put it really high. Occasionally dressed in women's clothes, went everywhere with his cat, including cavalry charges, and he won like several of Venice's greatest naval victories, certainly in the 17th century, and then in
great.
Lightning
so he's a 17th century. That's out of my 10. Yeah,
and in a lightning 3-year by 17th century standards blitzkrieg, he retook basically the entirety of Turkish Greece, bang bang bang, and then he took Athens, and I find him spectacular in his cunning Anyway, he's the patron in Venetian Heretic. He's the
he's the patron. I haven't got to the reveal of that yet. Okay,
but he's still a coming man in 1650. Although he is the hero of the. Anyway, I won't give any more away. I like him a lot.
Well, I don't want to give any spoilers to Venetian Heretic way, but I got to say there's one part of it that absolutely had me rolling on the ground laughing. It was just, I think it's something that all of us HEMA guys can appreciate. The part where he has the student come in, he's a fencing master, and he has the student come in, and he's like, and of course he hadn't practiced anything that I had told him to practice for the last week. It was like, oh man, we have all been there. And of course he didn't have money to pay for the lesson. Yes.
I confess to you that. So first of all, Richard Hughes isn't a real fencing master. He's actually a good fighter who's not a particularly educated fencer. Like he's gone to Cambridge for theology. You will find as you go on, he's really never had a fencing lesson in his life. And so
I kind of figured he was winging it. Yeah.
And he's winging it, but then he gets a copy of Gigante and and then this Jewish guy, Damazzo, who's a real guy who wrote a fabulous rapier manual and who was a Venetian Jew.
I got a copy of that after I read the book.
Yeah. He sort of hires him as an apprentice, and I meant it to be funny, and I also meant it to appeal to all the martial arts instructors I know, because
you got me.
The guys who show up and haven't done any work, and the guys who show up and just want to learn a trick, and the guys who just want to beat the fencing master. Come on, we all know these people.
So it's over and over and over.
And the student who can't stop but asking, but what if I do this?
I mean, it's just the first. I kind of got that as I was going, but the first one was just like, just the way that it's read. Also, the guy you have reading it is. I do the audiobook. The guy you have reading it is absolutely brilliant.
Peter Noble, as far as I'm concerned, is my long lost twin brother. The way he reads my book, I'll never want anyone else, except Anika Nkoya, who reads my science fiction novels in exactly the voice of Italian African that I think is perfect. Anyway.
Nice.
So there's actually, speaking of them getting the Gigante book, there's actually a pretty deep sort of HEMA connection there. So Manciolino's publisher, Niccolo Lozapino, he was a cantambanco. So he would go around and he would sing on the street. And he had this one person who was associated with him. I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now. But they basically had a business together. And so Niccolo would print books, and usually he'd print them in sort of the octava style. So they were little tiny books. And then his friend was a sort of an operatic singer. And so he would go out and on the street and he would sing, and Niccolo would kind of sing with him, and they would sing a passage from the book or make some sort of an advertisement for the book. Well, either way, these two end up kind of getting in trouble because they write this dissent against Venice, speaking of Venice, and Venice has spies everywhere. And they're giving this dissent in Ferrara. And it's a pretty funny little poem. It's actually kind of catchy, but they end up getting caught and they have to go to jail. And when they get out of jail, because again, a political dissident, basically, like it was at the time, because it was after the Battle of Agnadello, and so Venice was split between two kind of political factions in terms of just like the political zeitgeist at the time, and it was pro terra firma and anti terra firma. And so one of the anti terra firma senators ended up bailing them out of jail, but they were likely going to get their tongues cut out for speaking against the Serenisma as citizens. And so they end up getting out of jail, but Niccolo kind of never lost his edge. And after his friend died, one of the things that he started doing is he started publishing a whole bunch of Reformationist books. And one of the books that he printed, which is fascinating to me, was he printed Martin Luther under the alias of Erasmus.
Yeah. I know this story.
And so when I came across the way that they get their hands on that Gigante book, I was just sitting there. I was like, yes, this definitely happened.
Well, there's a book that I'm really just here to recommend other people's books, most of which are like historical, but there's a book called The Inquisitor in the Hat Shop. It's a weird title, but it's all about the Venetian Inquisition in detail. And a lot of it's about the publishing industry. I read a ton about the publishing industry, and it was one of my dad's big interests. So some of those books I already had from my dad. But when you need an imprimatur from the Senate and you need another one from the Pope just to publish your fencing manual,
right?
And when like in Venice, which had no law against some law, but no law that was enforced by the Senate against printing Protestant works, because you're hiring Protestant mercenaries to fight the Turks. So really you can't piss off the Duke of Brunswick.
Right.
But at the same exact time, you need the Knights of St. John to back your fleet. So you can't piss off the Pope. So you have to pretend to prosecute Protestant books. It must have been hilarious, by which I mean not very hilarious, to be a bookseller.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it was there are a number of stories about how, I mean, he had some really close calls. And there are a number of authors too that even like sought refuge in Bologna because they were just like, I can't do Venice anymore. Like Venice is too complicated.
It's too complicated and confusing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I try to bring that out. By the way, Josh and Steve are talking about a book that I am still trying to advertise, so I'm just going to mention the title.
Right. Yes.
It's called Venetian Heretic. It came out about a month and a half ago, and it is about an English. Let's call him a refugee, washed up from the English Civil War in Venice due to complicated circumstances. And I think a series of unfortunate events could have been another title. He's just the wrong guy in the wrong place in an almost Philip Marlowe way. And a lot of stuff happens around him, and eventually he decides to investigate it. And I hope you also caught on, because I meant it to be both funny in an ironic way and also more realistic. He's actually a terrible investigator. And if Philip, if his friend Philip had not shown up to dig his ass out of it, he'd never have figured out anything. Like, but I'm trying to say, like, this is the 17th century. Sherlock Holmes has not been born. And a long time ago, I read a fabulous historical book on early investigation, and it was an examination of a series of murders in London at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, so like the time of Napoleon. And so it's a mass murderer. It's a serial killer, and the serial killer keeps killing. And a wounded former Royal Navy officer, almost immediately, by modern standards, figures out who the criminal must have been. We still don't know for sure, but he fingers this guy. But the guy's a master butcher at the head of his guild, and the magistrates and the equivalent of cops keep saying, like, employed tradesmen do not commit crimes. This is, if not a gentleman, this is a wealthy, well-to-do man with a shop of his own and a wife and family. Impossible. And the more I read, the more I realized this is a dead common view of crime. Crime is committed by criminals. If criminals don't commit crime, you just never catch the person. And I tried to give Richard Hughes is a gentleman born, he's been to Cambridge. He pretty much believes that bad things are done by bad people, and he is a hopeless investigator. And I wanted that to be authentic.
It definitely came through.
He's not the brains of the outfit.
He's not.
But one thing that I really want to say about the Venetian Heretic that I'm loving, because I'm still reading it and I'm just loving it, is the way that you really feel that you're in Venice in the 1600s. The setting is just like if you're reading a Philip Marlowe novel, you would really feel like you're in 1920s or 1930s Los Angeles. You can smell the smog in those. In this one, it's like you can smell the canals. You can kind of hear the gondolas going by with the guys singing. You really just feel like you're in Venice, and I absolutely am loving it. And it's full of the kind of people that would really be there that are kind of, they're all doing their own thing, being their own people.
So 2 things I want to tell you desperately. One is you will run across an American First Nations person who is a basket weaver in Venice.
Oh,
I didn't make this up. This is not I'm so woke
great.
that I just had to throw a First Nations person in. It actually happened a little later in the century, but the Governor General of New France decided that the solution to his First Nations problem was to round up all the Iroquois, basically peace leaders who'd come for a peace conference, and send them to be galley slaves in France.
Of course it was.
And several of them were captured by a Turkish galley and then recaptured by a Venetian galley and ended up in Venice. And I just thought that this was like, how many Americans can imagine that there's an Iroquois chief in Venice in the 1650s? Like, Americans kind of think like the world starts with the Pilgrims. Anyway, so I could not help but tell that story, even though he's not really a major character, but his name is Scoss and he sort of comes and goes. And he can't really take it all very seriously. But there were an increasing number of First Nations people by the end of that century who had been to Paris or Venice or whatever, sometimes not under the friendliest conditions. And I've always been fascinated, because many of them were repatriated. When they went home, what did they say? Oh my God, there's a lot of them. No, honey, it's not just the ones you see. Anyway, that was one of the sort of weird stories about Venice that I really wanted to tell, but now I've forgotten what the other one was. That have you gotten to the chase scene, the gondola chase scene, Steve?
No. Oh, that sounds awesome.
Okay, well, one of the funnest things I've ever gotten to do. So, I've been on gondola rides before, and you pay a fairly exorbitant amount of money, and then you go wherever the gondolier wants to go. Because the gondoliers basically think, an American, they're all idiots. We'll go past Marco Polo's house. It's like there's no way you can avoid this. So I got a good advance for Venetian Heretic. That's the money they pay you up front. And I went to Venice. I had 1 day in Venice. I had a couple of friends with me from fighting in a tournament, as you do. As all of us do. And I said, listen, you don't have to pay anything, or you can go do your own thing. I'm going on a really long gondola ride. And they're like, oh, cool. So I literally said to I interviewed 3 gondoliers, and I'm like, I want to go this exact route. And it's that's all the way across Venice. Yep. We're going to go all the way from south to north across Venice. And he's like, okay, that'll be €300. Yep. Here it is in cash. And it was just great. It was absolutely great. And the gondolier really got into it. And so when you get to that scene, every bridge, I admit that bridges have changed. I have a map of 17th century Venice, but I decided deliberately to use the canals as they are now, because they have changed since the 17th century. But the bridges, the fighting, it's all based on, we actually did that, and it was super fun. Everybody should get to go on a 3.5 hour gondola.
That sounds amazing. I mean, you haven't been through there, Josh, but it's amazing how in Venice, the little canals are like little streets that go through all of these little towns. They're almost like little separate villages. And they really are. I got across is it's like 200 villages, all sort of physically interconnected and with these canals and streets, and it's phenomenal. And I can't imagine going on a trip like that for 3 hours. That sounds so cool.
My daughter had a great experience. She just had a few days to blow, so she decided she'd just stay in Venice. She was going to school in Greece for a little while, and she she was down in Judica just because that's where she could get an Airbnb. And she discovered that she had gone so far off the tourist path that there were people in her building who hadn't ever left Judica. And, like,
Wow.
and they're just, and I was like, I reminded myself of that every day when I was writing Venetian Heretic, is that Venice, like modern New York City, was a place where people might never leave their neighborhoods.
Right.
And
Why would you?
that, yeah, exactly, because the wine is so good and the food is so good. Yeah. I was a little disappointed to discover that my favorite Venetian dish, which William Gold eats several times, the other day I discovered that probably it didn't exist till the early 19th century.
Oh.
So I got that wrong. I hate it when I find I've made an anachronism. It just drives me nuts. Anyway, sorry, Bridge. Joshua, you were about to say.
It happens. I was going to say, I mean, one of the, outside of the, I mean, allow me to say that your descriptions, there are times in the book where I feel like you almost become poetic when you're describing Venice. Like, your love for Venice really kind of like shows through in your writing, because you get on a roll and you'll start throwing some alliteration in there and it just rolls, and it's just like, it's so smooth, and it's like, damn, it's really good.
I got to tell you, Josh, that is completely deliberate. I enjoy writing poetry, although I don't write it as much as I used to. And I really like English alliteration. Like, I like all that good Beowulf and stuff like that. To me, we should have stuck with alliteration in the English language. We're just not as rhymey as some other people. And sometimes I'll go back, not always, but especially at a paragraph end when I'm trying to get it to an emotional point, I'll go back and make it alliterative for a little extra punch. So thanks for noticing that. I really appreciate it, because frankly, sometimes I think no one will ever see this.
Oh no, yeah, it comes through. It definitely.
Whereas I know people will get fencing coach jokes. That
We'll be rolling on the floor laughing with the jokes.
And I'm pretty positive that whether you teach kendo or aikido or I'm pretty sure it's pretty much the same with students across that. No, you can't pay, and you haven't practiced. Cool. Yeah. Good.
Cool. Yep.
Please come back next week.
So outside of the beautiful
timeless.
descriptions and the canals and the city, one of the other sort of inseparable characteristics of the book, of course, is the Serenissima and the Inquisitor of the State, which you can't quite get away from. And that's something that Stephen and I are both very interested in at the moment, because, again, as we kind of alluded to at the start of this, Stephen has been primarily working from Marino Sanudo for a lot of the research that he's been doing lately. As a former espionage person, how do you view the Serenissima and how they conducted and how they kind of built up this amazing intel network?
Yeah. So first of all, was it that good? I have a book which I could fetch for you on the Venetian Secret Service, and I feel that the author completely fails to make his case that there was a Venetian Secret Service. And kind of like Sherlock Holmes, like, do you need spying? Sorry, sometimes I read really airy-fairy nonfiction, like, I loved philosophy in university. So I am interested in intellectual trends. And when I try to write authentically, whether it's the Middle Ages or ancient Greece or now the 17th century, I'm not going to beat you over the head with this because it's got to be a readable modern novel. But I am going to try and throw in their idea. So that was my long-winded startup to say, in a world of genuine diplomacy and international mercantile trade that is virtually unrestrictable, you almost can't stop them, right? Whether they're the English or the Venetians, if they have a ship, unless you sink it, they can pull into some tiny little port and fill up on your silk and leave and you don't have computers and you don't really have a border patrol, you're never going to catch them. So is anyone a spy, or is everyone a spy? Because what I think they had, I think what they had was information networks. And what Venice had was a brilliant network, but I'm not sure anyone in the network, except the person you mentioned before, the Bailey of Istanbul, the Venetian Bailey, who's clearly like the head of intelligence for dealing with the Ottomans. I don't think the rest of them would ever think they were doing anything but like their duty. And they're passing on reports because that's what you do. And the huge advantage that a couple of states had, England, Venice, definitely not Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, is that the little people felt invested in their state, so they participate in the reporting. Very small merchants would say, hey, I got lost in the fog and I passed through the Ottoman fleet and this is what I saw. Whereas I think in other countries that were more purely aristocratically based, if you were a small merchant, you didn't really have that much investment in the way the government worked. So why report? It's not really your problem.
I think that's one of the things, because I have the same book, and when I read it, that was one of the first things that struck me early on, was the author's claim that Venice was even sort of the first, or even that it didn't really happen until sort of the later 15th, early 16th century. Because that to me doesn't really line up with what I know of history. There's an example of so when Milan was about to attack Bologna, the Florentines were trying to prevent the Milanese and the Visconti from taking Bologna at all costs. And so what the Florentines did is they ended up paying Rupert II to come down into Italy to attack the Visconti. In the course of that, they sent this guy named Giovanni di Paolo Morelli to Germany, and he was in Aachen with the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was basically just trying to get him to agree to the fact that he was going to send troops, and then he was supposed to kind of monitor this whole process to make sure it actually happened, because the Germans oftentimes would promise things and never actually follow through with them. And so while he's there, there's an assassination attempt where they try to kill Rupert with a poison enema. So they pay off his doctor to give him a poison enema, and it gets uncovered because Morelli actually sees the assassin and he thinks it's suspicious. And so he tips him off and he says, I think there's an assassination attempt going on, because he's Florentine and he's looking around everywhere, and he records the fact that Rupert he was completely ambivalent, and he was so shocked and broken by the fact that somebody had actually tried to assassinate him, because he thought it was completely unreasonable and that nobody would ever try to kill him as the Holy Roman Emperor, right? But Morelli's I'm a Florentine.
Let me put this, I hear you, Joshua, and let me put this in an even broader term. Until about 1900, you could walk into any palace in any royal palace in the world. There was almost no security. There was literally almost no security. And if the king wasn't at, I think it's Holyrood, there weren't even tours. You could just, in Edinburgh, you could just walk in. And why didn't people steal the silver that was on display? Because they didn't. It's not our world. And we now live in a world where we take for granted that the assassination of leaders is a thing. But I agree. The Italian, he's on top of it, but the German is going, what? This isn't how the world works. Gentlemen don't assassinate other gentlemen. Supposedly in 1919, when the new head of American naval intelligence proposed having a censor clerk to go through, or I guess it was 1917, German mail in Washington, D.C., supposedly the Secretary of State said, gentlemen, do not open other gentlemen's mail.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
And it's important to remember statements like that when you're trying to reflect the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, Yeah. By the way, Josh, well told, good story. Because, and the reason I'm sort of praising you for this is I can't tell every story in the William Gold books. And so that right there is a story that I came across and went, but like page count. And so you originally started to talk about the Inquisitore di Stato.
Yeah.
What I'm not telling you about the Inquisitore di Stato is they all have such a variety of duties. So they're not really spies or cops or customs officials, or they're kind of all those things plus a bunch of very detailed duties that are usually have to do with logistics for the military. Right? Are you guys familiar with the office of the Inquisitors? Because it's the powers are deep but not broad, and very specific and very odd. And each Inquisitor has different powers, and they fight over the appointments and stuff. And they also change. And I'm not sure whether I'm being anachronistic about mine, because I have one really good description of how it all worked, and it's about 30 years after the time of the novel, and I'm just going with that's how it works.
Yeah.
I'm an imperfect researcher, and sooner or later, the perfect is the enemy of the good, or the enemy of getting the book out the door. But I think that every Venetian, I'm answering the question you originally asked, Joshua. I think every mid-level and above Venetian patrician was an amateur at 50 jobs simultaneously, and that's how their government ran.
That seems to be jive with what I'm saying too. The strength of it in their intelligence seems to be more their ability to collate different information coming from lots of people. Right. And distilling out what the 10, that basically the people who rule the government, need to know. And so that's what I think you have a lot in Sanudo, is all these reports, and then figuring out which of them is worth, matters. And then, of course, conflicting reports, right? Having to judge which of the reports to weigh, because they've got informers or friends, friend, informer, their own people, basically everywhere. So we're and Sanudo has everything in it, from like the price of cotton to Egypt, to what's going on in the Gulf of Arabia, to who just won the most recent election in Venice. And it's just this fire hose of information. And I think that maybe Venice was the first people that tried to systematically organize this collection of information into something usable.
I think you are exactly right, Steve. I think Frederick Lane somewhere says when the DHE, the 10, acquire a secretary with 2 undersecretaries, that they are the first intelligence or news collators. You could call them, like, it's a newsroom, but that Western Europe has ever had. I know that Byzantinists argue, I don't know how it came out, that the logothete of the drum in the Byzantine Empire was an intelligence officer, and I think he was in charge of entertainment at court, but offices move around.
He did a pretty bad job in 1204, that's for sure.
How long do you think that they had this situation going? Because the reason I wanted to tell that Morelli story is because it ends with, like, he comes back down into northern Italy, and the Visconti try to have him assassinated. But it's the Venetians who tip him off when he's in Padua, and they basically tell him, hey, there are Milanese spies that are following you, and you need to ditch them. And so he does, and he ends up getting away. So, like, there's already stories of the Venetians kind of passing on information, or even collating information, going all the way back to 1402. And we have other instances that we know of in the mid-15th century. For example, this guy named Benedetto Dai, who's a Florentine news collator. So he's a Gazette collector, if you want to call him that. And so it seems like this notion of this practice is older. Have you found any evidence of how old it might be, or how long it had been going on?
I don't think I have any evidence that would be new to you. I will say that I believe that the Venetians maybe led the way in paying for information, or even just understanding. And I think it's because they have an international merchant culture. I bet so does Florence, but Venice, shipping news, that term? I grew up on a coast. The shipping news, like if you're in shipping, you need to know, over in Alexandria, are they burning their suburbs? Can I get,
Right.
What's Aleppo like this year? This is life or death to a merchant city where you could sit in northern England growing your crops and keeping your sheep on the hills, and you don't care whether they're having a peasant revolt in France. That's their business. You're doing your thing. I think Venice, really from the 7th century on, because we know that mercantile Venice goes at least back to I didn't mean the 7th, I mean the 9th. In the 800s, so they have such a long period of international contact that I think it makes it much easier for them to realize we need to keep the information flow going. We need to reward people who report. But yeah, I sort of hint at this in my novels, but I don't think I could prove to you they were even collating in the 14th century, because I think those offices are created in the early 15th century. That is the secretary of the Dieci and the two undersecretaries. I think that's 1415 or 1420.
The thing that I thought was really interesting about reading about Dai is the way that he would trade information. And this is another theme that I kind of picked up on that you kind of touched on in the Venetian Heretic, is how relationships and creating relationships was as important to this sense of kind of the state and the way that state handled espionage. And that's kind of what Dai was known for. So he would make a relationship with the Gonzaga and then the Bentivoglio, and then he would get information from the Gonzaga. He would trade some piece of information that they were interested in for a piece of information that somebody else may be interested in. And then he would take that to those people and he would say, hey, I've got this really interesting thing. Do you want to pay me for it? And they would say yes. And so what's interesting is it almost reads like it came straight out of the Venetian Heretic, because his best friend is Giovanni degli Arentini, who's a famous writer and satirist at the time. And so they're best friends, and he actually co-opts him into joining him in this enterprise and starting to collect news for him. And after Dai dies, Arentini actually tries to continue his business for a little while, but he doesn't have the same connections. So it's where does that because I feel like that's always a thing, there's who do you know and how do you create these connections and how do you kind of build up these networks?
Let me spin this a different way. I mean, first of all, another huge advantage Venice has is this identity thing that I think a lot of Italians in the 15th, 16th, and even 17th century really didn't have. They might have thought of themselves as Bolognese, but one of the things I've been noticing, I've been following some priests because I'm interested in them as potential fencers. Just roll with me here. I'm trying to see if Bologna was a center of fencing because it was also a center of religious education. And I'm way off topic here, but I read a book that said, eventually the church decided it needed its own professional soldiers. It couldn't just keep hiring idiots. And so it basically was ordaining priests and then going well, you're young and fit. We're going to send you to a fencing master. It's a nice theory. It hasn't been proven yet. Yeah. Just roll with it. But one of the things I noticed when I look at the little bios of some fathers of the church and other Italians is that there is a whole population, especially amongst educated middle-class men, who are born in Bologna, but then they end up in Rome, and then they're serving Venice, and then they're in Padua, and then they end up with the Duke of Mantua. So clearly they don't have one loyalty. And I think that one of Venice's advantages is that most everyone in Venice, down to the Arsenali class, is Venetian first. So if they get information, they will pass it on to Venice. Whereas there's a lot of people in Italy who are like, well, I don't really care what happens to Bologna anymore. I don't, screw the Dukes of Florence. If I get some dirt on them, and I think that while there's a lot of intelligence trade, and I will say as a former veteran, they used to say never play give to get, like never exchange information with another intelligence officer from a rival service. And I remember thinking even then, that's how intelligence worked until fairly recently. Interesting. The fact that you have to tell me this tells me that people do it. Anyway.
Yep. Right.
But I see what you see, Joshua. I see a lot of give to get, and I think that, again, I'm rattling on, but there's an international society. Just think about how sword fighting works. Think about what nobility is. This is much more than today, or maybe more than anything today, but maybe soccer players. This is a society that crosses all kinds of borders in the, I don't want to say patrician, but in the, let's say, military caste, where somebody like Raimondo Montecuccoli, who's one of my favorite generals, is born in central Italy and ends up leading the Holy Roman Empire against the Turks at the end of the 18th century. Excuse me, how exactly does that follow that career path? I could name some other French generals who end up fighting for England or Germany, and Schönbrunn who ends up fighting for Venice, and very international military society. And in that world, individual loyalties may not be as important, and people pass on information more easily. And a lot of Sanudo, pardon me, I haven't read as much of it as you probably have, just seems to me like gossip. You won't believe what they're doing over in Madrid.
Absolutely. I mean, he has the description of the death of Alexander VI. He throws in that there was a devil that supposedly leapt out of him into the room. But then he'll give you a ducat by ducat breakdown of the Venetian army that's going off to fight the French. And that's accurate because they're having to pay every single guy, and that's one thing that they're going to get right. So it's interesting how it just varies.
Yeah, let me just put in a little ad for modern Venice. The Venetian state papers online are incredibly easy to access, and in some cases are already translated into English.
Great.
I assume that's the Italian government. I've never looked into that. Maybe it's just a university that's done it. But anyway, a lot of Italian state papers are available online. The internet is not completely useless.
It's amazing.
And
you'll have to send me a link, and I'll put it in there.
When you can just do a keyword search, it's good. It's so easy. Because my Italian is terrible, but with a keyword search, I can fight my way through and figure out that this. Oh, look, there's a date. That's what I really needed.
Right.
So your theory is actually pretty interesting about the priests. Should I tell them, Stephen? Should I spill the beans?
I mean, I don't know. Your stuff's always good. You kind of have your space, man. I trust your instincts.
Okay. All right. So we actually think
this is a wild theory that might be floating around. Here's the basis for it.
It's not that wild. We're starting to kind of build this up a little bit. We have a prospective Antonio Manciolino that was a priest.
I'm liking it already.
Yeah.
And his house was apparently blasted down during the siege of Bologna in 1512.
Yep. So when the Spanish were firing a whole bunch of cannonballs, that area was primarily built up for it was where most of the armor production and weapons manufacturing was going on in Bologna. So that's probably why they targeted it. But it was also it's his house, a house that he owned with his brother, was actually roughly a block away from Marozzo's school, which is super fascinating.
That is super fascinating.
Yeah. But there is this trend in the mid 16th century where there are actually a couple of Bolognese knights, Giovanni di Legnano, or not Giovanni di Legnano. What's his name? That's the other Giovanni. One of the Legnanos, Antonio de Legnano, actually works with a bunch of cardinals to kind of create this new model Jesuit army for the Pope to go fight the Huguenots after the first campaign against the Huguenots. So there's a lot there. That's actually a really interesting theory.
This is a really, anyway, I'm too old. Some graduate student needs to do it.
Yeah. Do you want to conclude with anything there, Stephen? You want to propose your Giacomo de Bondi?
I would, but I saw that Christian's already working on something else related to the Serenissima, so let's just keep him rolling on that. We were just thinking it would be fun to have a Giacomo Bondo set in Renaissance Venice, a James Bond style intelligence.
Oh, you guys haven't read Tom Swan.
I have read Tom Swan.
Not.
Yeah. I have, like, I don't know, 24 adventures that are basically 15th century James Bond.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It's already been done.
And Indiana Jones.
All based very heavily on a real guy named Syriac of Ancona, who Wikipedia refers to him as the grandfather of archaeology, and I think the grandfather of grave robbing would be a more accurate description.
It's just two sides of the same coin, brother.
I'm going back to Joshua, but to both of you, Syriac of Ancona is a great example of Venetian, because he's not pro-Venetian, and yet he ends up feeding the Venetian information system on several occasions, and he knows he is. And even though he's not pro-Venetian, it's a job. and because he is, amongst other things, gathering artifacts for Bessarion, and because Bessarion is, in effect, part of the Venetian machinery, like, he knows that anything he says to Bessarion is going straight to the Council of Ten. But that doesn't keep him from making money and bringing artifacts to Bessarion and saying, hey, by the way, did you know the Turkish fleet is forming up off the Isle of Lesbos? And Joshua, like, I've got to say, if we're coming to the wrap up, man, you got to go to Europe. Like, it's all there. It's still there.
Cool.
I know.
We got to do a field trip, bro.
I don't know if you follow me on any social media, but like every time, and I'm just saying this because recently I put up a picture of the Parthenon. Every time I look at the Parthenon, I stop dead and just go like, yep, here we are, the birth of democracy. Like, it's like a temple to democracy to me. On a hill, beautiful. The temple on a hill that people talk about. It's the Parthenon in Athens. and downtown Verona, Venice, Milan, I've really not been to Milan more than once, but like all of them, you don't have to have a fertile imagination. Right, Steve? You go to Venice, you sort of walk around any corner and go, oh my God, I'm in 1351.
Yeah,
like,
you have to do is just get away from the stream of tourists that go from the train station to the Piazza San Marco.
Yeah.
And the rest of the city is beautiful and free and amazing.
Yeah. And
awesome.
Literally spend a day doing what everybody else does when you go to Venice. And then, now that you've done those things, because they're all worth doing, it is worth going to San Marco. It is worth drinking a white wine on the Piazza San Marco. It is worthwhile going through the Doge's Palace. Once you've done all that, literally get lost in Venice. I would say it is one of the great joys of life. Like, walk off or get in a gondola and say, here's 200 euro, take me somewhere.
What we do, to have a true experience, we'll grab sticks and bucklers, we'll find a square, and we'll fence there until the police come to find us, and then we'll run away.
Okay, so Steve, do you guys know Sebastian de Castel, Canadian fantasy writer, also a sword guy? So Sebastian and I invite both of you. What we want to do is go to Venice and write every day, and then dress in period clothing and fence on bridges. Like,
just tell me the day, man. I'll see if I can.
You don't have to threaten me with
that. Sounds amazing. That sounds absolutely amazing.
unmatched and matched weapons, just like you bring whatever you feel like. It's 4 o'clock. We're meeting on the Rialto. Bang, 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 and then just walk away. Because just like no, that didn't happen. Nope.
Because if you don't have a bruise, an aperitif is just not right. You
That's right.
You got to nurse that bruise with the alcohol, and you get that Bravo experience.
It was fighting in armor in Verona that taught me a lot about Italian cocktails and what they're really for, or what you're really doing.
I love it. That sounds like a great time.
That is.
I'm trying to. My mind is blanked on the deep red, very bitter Italian like aperitif, and I never used to like it, and then a bunch of us fought in this Italian tournament, and afterwards they were serving this because we fought on the Piazza d'Erbe in Verona, and then we're like sitting around drinking aperitifs, and we're still in our army clothes, and I'm like, this is the life. Why?
Where did we go wrong?
Where did we go wrong? Exactly. That was with Sean Hayes and Greg Melee and like 5 or 6. Anyway, good times. We were the American team. Gentlemen, I'm going to go cook dinner. I believe that if my wife walks by one more time, it will be bad. So,
been great, Christian.
Christian,
Real honor.
thank you for your time.
It's been great, and like I've had such a good time. If you want to talk again, want to talk about different books, want to talk about Greece, because I feel we sort of cheated our way past Greece, and I have more to say, and I know that Joshua had more to say. I could sense it. So if you want to have me back sometime, we could talk about.
I think we'll do that.
All right.
Gentlemen, thanks for having me.
Christian, thank you so much, sir. It's been great.
Good night.